Hello everyone and welcome to the Unanswered Questions True Crime Podcast.
I have spent hours and hours investigating this.
He basically told her that people have been killed. Journalists, independent investigators, people like that disappeared. It frightened her to the bone.
There's more to the story than meets the eye.
There were rumors of torture and homicide and sexual abuse, all sorts of egregious, horrendous crimes.
He was polygraphed 3 times. Each of those 3 showed evasions.
His resumes were a skeleton of truth.
He was mad at the world, and particularly mad at the government.
The study that he commissioned described a fictional terrorist attack.
If people have died over this, it means you're getting close to the truth.
You don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to say, what the fuck?
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of my new podcast, Unanswered Questions, where every week we will endeavour to discuss a mysterious unsolved case that has many lingering unanswered questions. So I hope you enjoy, and as always, leave me some feedback on what you think about the show and rate it as well. Now on to the show. This week we'll be talking about the Groveland Four case. The Groveland Four, or the Groveland Boys, were 4 African-American men, Ernest Thomas, Charles Greenlee, Samuel Shepard, and Walter Irvin. In July of 1949, the 4 were accused of raping a white woman and severely beating her husband in Lake County, Florida. The oldest, Thomas, tried to elude capture and was killed that month. The others were put on trial, and Shepard and Irvin received death sentences, and Greenlee was sentenced to life in prison. The events of the case led to serious questions about the arrests, allegedly coerced confessions and mistreatment, and the unusual sentencing following their convictions. Their incarceration was exacerbated by their systemic and unlawful treatment, including the death of Shepard and the near-fatal shooting of Irvin, which I'll go into later in this podcast. Greenlee was paroled in 1962 and Irvin in 1968. All 4 were posthumously exonerated by the state of Florida in 2021. Now we get into the details of the case. Thomas, Shepard, Irvin, and Greenlee, then 16, were accused of raping 17-year-old Norma Paget and assaulting her husband on July 16th of 1949 in Groveland, Lake County, Florida. On July 26th of 1949, Thomas fled and was killed by a sheriff's posse of 1,000 white men who shot him over 400 times while he allegedly fled after being found asleep under a tree in southern Madison County. Greenlee, Shepard, and Irvin were arrested. They were beaten to coerced confessions, but Irvin refused to confess. The 3 survivors were convicted at trial by an all-white jury. Greenlee was sentenced to life in prison because he was only 16 at the time of the alleged crime. The other 2 were sentenced to death. In 1949, Harry T. Moore, the executive director of the Florida NAACP, organized a campaign against the wrongful conviction of the 3 African Americans. 2 years later, the case of 2 defendants reached the Supreme Court of the United States on appeal, with special counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Thurgood Marshall, as the defense counsel. In 1951, the US Supreme Court ordered a retrial after hearing the appeals of Shepard and Irvin. It ruled that they'd not received a fair trial because no evidence had been presented, because of excessive adverse publicity, as well as because black people had been excluded from the jury. The court overturned their convictions and remanded the case to the lower court for a new trial. In November of 1951, Sheriff Willis V. McCall of Lake County, Florida, shot Irvin and Shepard while they were in his custody and handcuffed together. McCall claimed they'd tried to escape while he was transporting them from Ryford State Prison back to the county seat of Tavares for the new trial. Shepard died on the spot and Irvin survived and later told FBI investigators that McCall had shot them in cold blood and that his deputy Yates had also shot him in an attempt to kill him. Harry Moore called for the governor of Florida to suspend McCall. On Christmas night of 1951, a bomb went off below Moore's house, fatally wounding both him and his wife. He died that night and his wife followed 9 days later. The bombers were never caught. Now, that is a case that I have covered previously on this podcast. In fact, it is the episode before this one, so if you'd like to check that out on my YouTube channel or wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, iTunes, anywhere like that, please do. At the second trial, Irvine was represented by Marshall and again convicted by an all-white jury and sentenced to death. In 1955, his death sentence was commuted to life in prison by recently elected Governor Leroy Collins. He was paroled in 1968 but died the next year in Lake County, purportedly of natural causes. Greenlee was paroled in 1962 and lived with his family until he died in 2012. In 2016, the city of Groveland and Lake County each apologized to survivors of the four men for the injustice against them. On April 18th of 2017, a resolution of the Florida House of Representatives requested that all four men be exonerated. The Florida Senate quickly passed a similar resolution. Lawmakers called on Governor Rick Scott to officially pardon the men. On January 11th of 2019, the Florida Board of Executive Clemency voted to pardon the Groveland Four. Newly elected Governor Ron DeSantis subsequently did so, and on November 22nd of 2021, Judge Heidi Davis granted the state's motion to posthumously exonerate the men. Now we get into the accused in this case. First we have Charles L. Greenlee. Charles L. Greenlee, born June 4th of 1933 in Florida, was the son of Thomas H. and Emma Greenlee, who were born in Georgia and Alabama respectively. His family was living in Columbia County when he was 2, but they'd moved to Baker County by the time Charles was 12. His father worked in turpentine manufacturing in 1935 and later as a labourer, likely also in the timber industry. In 1945, Charles and 4 of his siblings were all in school. Greenlee had come to Groveland in July of 1949 looking for work, as he was already married and his wife was pregnant. Now we come to Walter Irvin. Walter Lee Irvin, born 8th of May 1927 in Gainesville, Florida, was living in Groveland when he registered for the draft in May of 1945. He listed his mother, Ella Irvin, as next of kin. He was working at the time for Apaswa Groves. He was recorded as 5'3" and weighing 105 pounds and was described in his registration as light brown with brown eyes and black hair. He served in the army, leaving with the rank of private. Now we come to Samuel Shepard. Samuel Shepard, born April 7th of 1927, was born in Fitzgerald, Georgia, to Henry Shepard and his wife Charlie M. Robinson Shepard, both of Georgia. His father was working in the lumber industry, and the Shepard family moved to Groveland, Florida, where his father achieved ownership of his own farm by clearing and developing former swampland. When Samuel Shepard registered for the draft in 1945, he was described as 5'8", 149 pounds, with a light brown complexion, brown eyes and black hair. He gave his father Henry Shepard as next of kin. Shepard and Irvine were friends and fellow veterans after World War II. Now we come to Ernest Thomas, the last member in this case. Ernest Thomas, born in Florida, was married by July 1949 and living and working near Groveland. He had encouraged Greenlee to come there because of jobs related to the citrus groves. After returning to Groveland following their military service, Shepard and Irvine both continued to wear their uniforms. They were proud of their service, which some of the local whites resented. Sheriff Willis McCall was known for supporting segregation and keeping a strong hold on workers and against union organizing. He was part of ensuring there was a ready supply of low-wage workers to man the orange groves. Shepard could work with his father, and Irvine was determined to find an alternative to the orange groves. Now we get to the events in this case. Ernest Thomas, Charles Greenlee, age 16, Samuel Shepard, age 22, and Walter Irvin, age 22, were identified by the police as suspects. Shepard and Irvine were both veterans of service in the army, and both Thomas and Greenlee were married. Irvine and Shepard were arrested shortly after Paddock reported the attack. The police took the men in their patrol car to a secluded spot and ordered them out of the car. Both men were beaten by police with blackjacks and fists and kicked as they lay on the ground. While being asked if they had picked up a white girl, afterward they were taken to a spot where the crime happened. Deputy Yates inspected Shepard's shoes, which he had worn the night before. Yates was frustrated to see that the soles did not match footprints in the ground at the scene. Irvine's were the same, but Irvine claimed that he was wearing a different pair of shoes. The two men were taken to Tavers jail, where they were interrogated in the basement while cuffed to overhead pipes and severely beaten. A mob rioted and burned Shepard's house and two others to the ground. Only the presence of the National Guard halted the destruction caused by the rioters. Cockcroft, the leader of the riot, revealed the mob's intentions when he told a reporter, quote, "The next time we'll clean out every Negro section in South Lake County," end quote. Now we come to the fleeing suspect. Charles Greenlee was a 16-year-old who'd come from Gainesville and was trying to find work with his friend Ernest Thomas. Thomas had convinced Greenlee there were plenty of jobs in Groveland. Greenlee was waiting at a rail depot to meet Thomas when he was arrested and brought to the police station under suspicion. Greenlee was interrogated and beaten in a cell that night until he admitted to the rape of Norma Paget. Thomas escaped capture and fled Lake County the following morning. Greenlee admitted to having been with Thomas. Police later learned where the latter lived and where he was hiding, as they found a letter in his letterbox addressed to his wife. Lake County Sheriff Willis McCall appointed a posse of more than 1,000 armed men. They found and killed Thomas about 200 miles or 320 kilometers away in Madison County, Florida, following a lengthy chase through the swamps. He was shot by the posse at least 400 times and died of his wounds. Officers reported that Thomas was armed and allegedly reached for a weapon. According to the coroner's inquest, Lake County Sheriff McCall was at the scene when Thomas was shot. The coroner's jury determined that Thomas had been lawfully killed and ruled his death a justifiable homicide. Really, so you shoot a guy who's unarmed 400 times and somehow that's a justifiable homicide? It just goes to show how things were back then, and how there was little regard for black people. I mean, these two cases really show you how things were for black people back then, and I feel truly sorry for black people of that era and what they had to go through. They suffered tremendously, and it's very horrible to read about, such as these cases. It really makes you want to cry of the injustices that they suffered. It really does. It makes me want to cry, really. Now we come to the trial. A grand jury indicted the three remaining rape suspects, Shepard and Greenlee, separately later told FBI investigators that the deputies beat them until they confessed. Irvine refused to confess despite also being severely beaten. An FBI investigation concluded that the Lake County Sheriff's Department deputies James Yates and Leroy Campbell were responsible for the beatings, and agents documented the physical abuse with photographs. The Justice Department urged the U.S. Attorney in Tampa to file charges, but U.S. Attorney Herbert Phillips was reluctant and failed to return indictments. The NAACP helped with the men's defense, hiring Orlando attorney Franklin Williams. After interviewing the three surviving suspects, Williams said each had independently stated that he was beaten by Lake County deputies. Shepard and Greenlee both told FBI agents that they confessed to raping Paddock in order to stop the beatings. Irvine never confessed and maintained his innocence. Thurgood Marshall, the leader of the NAACP, pressed the Justice Department and the FBI to initiate a civil rights and domestic violence investigation into the beatings. Marshall convinced the Justice Department that the beatings violated the men's rights, and the FBI dispatched agents to investigate. The FBI later concluded that Lake County deputies James Yates and Leroy Campbell had violated the Groveland men's civil rights and urged U.S. Attorney Herbert Phillips of Florida to prosecute, but a grand jury did not return indictments of the deputies. The prosecution also never introduced the coerced confessions as evidence into the trial. There is also uncertainty about whether Paget was raped. The prosecution did not question Dr. Jeffrey Bineveld, the physician who examined her, on the stand. Judge Truman Futch did not permit the defense to call the doctor as a witness, and according to his records, Bineveld could not tell whether she'd been raped. He found no evidence of tears or wounds in the vagina other than the lacerations mentioned above. Laboratory analysis of a vaginal smear revealed no spermatozoa present in the vagina, nor any organisms resembling gonocchi, which could have been other evidence of sex. There were no other gross signs of bruises, breaks in the skin, or other signs of violence. Shepard and Irvine said that they had been drinking together in Eatonville, Florida the night of the alleged attack, and Greenlee said he was nowhere near the other defendants on that night, and that he had never met Shepard and Irvine before. The defense accused Sheriff McCall's deputies of manufacturing evidence to win a conviction. All three men were convicted by the all-white jury. Shepard and Irvine were sentenced to death, and Greenlee was sentenced to life, as he was a minor. Now we get into the appeals and the shootings that took place. The NAACP took on assisting the defense in appeals. In 1951, Marshall led the defense in an appeals hearing for Irvine and Shepard at the U.S. Supreme Court. It overturned the convictions of both men based on adverse pretrial publicity and remanded the case to the lower court for a new trial. Greenlee had not appealed his sentence of life imprisonment. McCall was transporting Shepard and Irvin from Rayford State Prison back to the Lake County Jail in Tavros when he claimed to have a flat tire. Alone with the two handcuffed prisoners, McCall pulled down a dirt road to inspect the tire outside Umatilla, Florida, north of Tavros. He claimed that Shepard asked to relieve himself, and when the two prisoners handcuffed together got out of the car, they attacked McCall. He drew his pistol and shot at them. The shooting took place on a dark country road outside the town, and he shot each prisoner 3 times. Shepard was killed instantly, and Irvin survived by playing dead. The following morning at the hospital where he had been taken for treatment, Irvin told FBI agents and reporter Mabel Norris-Reese that the shootings was unprovoked. He said McCall had shot him and Shepard in cold blood, staging the scene to make it look like an escape attempt, and that Lake County Deputy James Yates had joined McCall at the scene, seeing that Irvin was still breathing, and fired one last shot through Irvin's neck. Irvin miraculously survived. The FBI later found a bullet buried in the ground beneath Irvin's blood spot that appeared to support his account of the shooting. A nail found in the front wheel of McCall's car appeared to have caused his claimed tire trouble that night. McCall said that he had no idea how the nail got there, but the FBI believed that it had been placed there. An all-white coroner's jury made up of many of McCall's friends took half an hour to find Shepard's death justified. They concluded that McCall had been acting in line of duty and in self-defense. McCall was cleared of any wrongdoing. Now we come to the Harry T. Moore bombing, which I've covered in the previous episode of this podcast. Harry T. Moore, executive director of the Florida NAACP, demanded in 1951 that McCall be indicted for murder following the Groveland rape case and requested that the governor suspend him from office. 6 weeks after calling for McCall's removal, Moore and his wife were killed by a bomb that exploded under their bedroom in Mims, Brevard County, Florida on the 25th of December 1951. But an extensive FBI investigation at the time and additional separate investigations in 1978, 1991 and 2005 found no evidence of McCall's involvement. In 2005, a new investigation was launched by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement that included an excavation of the Moore home to search for forensic evidence. On August 16th of 2006, Florida Attorney General Charlie Crist announced his office had completed its 20-month investigation, resulting in the naming of 4 then suspects: Earl Brooklyn, Tillman Brevlin, Joseph Cox, and Edward Spivey, who were all deceased. All 4 had a long history with the Ku Klux Klan, KKK, serving as officers in the Orange County Clavern. Although members of the Klan were suspected of the crime, the people responsible were never brought to trial. Now we come to Irvin's second trial in later life. After recovering from his shooting wounds, Irvin was tried again after refusing a deal from the prosecutor and Governor Fuller Warren that would have spared him from the death sentence if he pleaded guilty. His defense counsel, Thurgood Marshall, gained a change of venue to the Marion County, Florida because of the extensive and adverse publicity around the case in Lake County. Marshall led the defense team from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Irvin was again found guilty, and Judge Futch was presiding, sentenced him to death. After Leroy Collins was elected governor in 1954, questions were raised to him about Irvin's case. Because he was considered moderate, he reviewed it and in 1955 commuted Irvin's sentence to life in prison, stating that neither trial proved conclusively that Irvin was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Irvin was paroled in 1968, and in 1969 he visited Lake County, where he was found dead in his car, officially of natural causes. Now we come to Greenlee being paroled. Greenlee was paroled from prison in 1962. He moved to Nashville, Tennessee with his wife and their daughter Carol, who was born in 1950. His wife was pregnant when he was arrested. They had a son, Thomas, in 1965, and Greenlee died on April 18th of 2012, but not before seeing Gilbert King's 2012 book about the case published. Now we come into the exoneration of these 4 men. In 2016, the Lake County Commission followed Groveland Mayor Tim Lukes in presenting the surviving families of the Groveland Four with a promiscuous apology. Both Lukes and members of the Lake County Commission then began lobbying state lawmakers to do the same. Senator Geraldine Thompson D. Orlando filed a proposed resolution SCR 136 for consideration during the 2016 legislative session to clear the names of Greenlee, Irvin, Shepard, and Thomas and note the egregious wrongs the criminal justice system perpetrated against them. On April 18th of 2017, the Florida House of Representatives passed a resolution sponsored by State Representative Bobby Dubose requesting exoneration for the 4 men and apologizing to their families for the injustice of the case. The Florida State Senate passed an identical resolution sponsored by Senator Gary Farmer on April 27th of 2017. The resolutions called on Governor Rick Scott to expedite the process to grant posthumously pardons. Lawmakers also called on Scott to pardon the men. On January 11th of 2019, the Florida Board of Executive Clemency, with newly seated Governor Ron DeSantis at the helm, unanimously agreed to pardon the Groveland Four. 70 years is a long time, DeSantis said before taking office, and that's the amount of time 4 young men have been wrongly written into Florida's history for crimes they did not commit and punishments they did not deserve. End quote. Norma Paddock, then 86, speaking publicly about the case for the first time since 1952, attended the Clemency Board hearing to make a statement against exoneration, saying, quote, "I'm begging y'all not to give them pardon because they done it. Your minds might be made up. I don't know. If you do, you're gonna be just like them. And that's all I gotta say, because I know I'm telling the truth. I went to court twice." End quote. DeSantis issued the 4 men full posthumously pardons in 2019, but they were not exonerated by the state until 2021. After a motion submitted by State Attorney William M. Gladstone, Judge Heidi Davis granted the state's motion on November 22nd of 2021 to posthumously dismiss the indictments of Thomas and Shepard and vacate the convictions of Greenlee and Irvin. To this day, the Groveland Four case remains controversial and unresolved. With that, this case remains open, but with many unanswered questions that still remain unanswered. Please rate the show and let me know what you guys think about this and the many other cases I've covered. You can follow me on all major social media platforms, YouTube, BitChute, Dailymotion. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram. Links are all down below in the description. If you have a case you'd like me to have a look at or cover, don't hesitate to send me a message. I'm your host, and this has been the Unanswered Questions podcast. Until next time. Next on Unanswered Questions. On February 6th of 1996, Joey Gladden was found with a bullet in his head sitting on his sofa. He was still wearing his jacket and had just opened a can of beer. A .22 caliber pistol was found on the floor at his feet.